Reports that President Trump intervened in the security clearances for his daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared and provided new leads for congressional committees to look into. Last week, Oversight Committee Chair Elijah Cummings threatened to subpoena the White House for documents related to that clearance protocol. In a letter to Cummings, White House counsel Pat Cipollone called the request overly intrusive, adding, "We will not concede the executive's constitutional prerogatives." Well, in a statement back, Cummings responded, "There is a key difference between a president who exercises his authority under the Constitution and a president who overrules career experts and his top advisors to benefit his family members and then conceals his actions from the American people." I'm joined right now by Leon Panetta, former director of the CIA, Defense Department Secretary, former congressman, and former chief of staff to President Clinton. Thank you so much, Mr. Panetta. What do you make of this, watching this whole, because you've been through procedural arguments about clearances and who gets an ID to walk around the White House and who gets the top security information. What does it tell you when the FBI says no to two applicants?
Well, it is about national security. That's the reason we provide security clearances, is to make sure that when it comes to highly classified information, that you are not allowing someone who could be a risk to be able to receive that information. And look, this kind of information is put together by CIA officers and sources that are putting their lives on the line in order to bring this information to the attention of the president and those around him. To allow somebody who is a risk, a security risk, to access to that kind of information is to not only compromise that information, it is really putting our national security at risk itself. That no president ought to be allowed to do.
Well, what's your suspicion here? Is that Jared is too close to Netanyahu's government, too close to Khashoggi? I mean, that sounds ironic that both of them would be too close to him. Is it fear that he would give away the stuff, give away the information to people that we're negotiating with? Is that a fear?
Well, look, there is a security clearance process, and it involves the Personnel Security Office in the White House, which investigates and does a background check on anyone who's supposed to get a security clearance. Obviously, they registered concerns. What those concerns are, I don't know. I assume it's related to his contacts, not only with the Russians, but with other foreign dignitaries as well. So because of that concern that that information could be jeopardized, the recommendation of the FBI and the security office was not to give him a clearance. John Kelly and Consul McGahn obviously were thrown the ball by the president in the hope that they would bypass the FBI, did not do that, and instead wrote memos to the record about why they were not going to allow that to proceed. And the president went around him and allowed that security clearance to happen. That should not happen. I think the Congress, if it's going to look at anything, has to look at how do you make sure that when there is a security risk, that the FBI and the security people make that call, not the president or anybody else.
What would it mean to you? I mean, I'm not asking if you had to ever doing it, but the fact that you've been chief of staff to a president, you have to keep things going. If you would have to write a memo to yourself for the record that you did something you really didn't want to do, is that what they're really saying? They were saying, I did something I didn't want to do.
Well, I think it's for the historical case, I'm sure, that both of them wanted to make sure that when history comes back, if they found that information was jeopardized because of allowing the security clearance, that they would not bear the brunt of blame for having granted it. So, you know, I think that was the reason they did it. I've never had to do that, thank God. But clearly, I think what was behind this was to try to protect their own reputation with regards to the security clearance.
Speaking of security, here's a big question. Meanwhile, President Trump responded to new evidence today, he did, that North Korea is rebuilding a key missile site, possibly in preparation for another test. NBC News reports tonight that satellite images of the site, there they are, taken just 2 days after Trump's failed nuclear summit with Kim Jong-un, show the regime is quickly working to rebuild a site used to launch long-range missiles aimed at guess who? North Korea began dismantling that site after President Trump's first meeting with Kim in Singapore last June. However, here's the presentation today trying to explain it.
Well, we're going to see. It's too early to see, but we have to solve a problem. We have a very nasty problem there. We have to solve a problem. The relationship is good. I would be very disappointed if that were happening. It's a very early report. We're the ones that put it out. But I would be very, very disappointed in Chairman Kim, and I don't think I will be, but we'll see what happens. We'll take a look. It'll ultimately get solved.
Mr. Panetta, by the way, you missed this on the picture. There's the president saying that appeasing line of his with a bronze of Winston Churchill behind him on the shelf. And here he is justifying Kim Jong-un's behavior with Winston Churchill behind him. It doesn't seem to get the disconnect, if you call it that. Your thoughts, why is he covering for Kim?
This whole thing was haywire from the beginning. To think that somehow he and Kim could sit down and pull off an agreement that would denuclearize North Korea was, I think, a basic mistake and a critical mistake by the President of the United States. And it's proven to be a mistake because this whole summitry between the two of them has basically flopped. It's a disaster. And the North Koreans now have gone ahead and started to improve their missile site with a clear message that they may very well go ahead and test another ICBM. And the President of the United States is now stuck because he's given Kim a world stage. He's given him a tremendous amount of credibility as a world leader by virtue of these meetings. He's lost leverage in that relationship. And so the president, one way or another, has to regain some leverage here. I don't know how he's going to do it, but he can't just do it by being nice to Kim.
Yeah, flirtation doesn't seem to be working. Hey, it's great to have you on, Secretary Leon Panetta. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.